guys, in today's video we're going to be talking about this really cool houseplant called the Fatsia Japonica, more commonly known as the Japanese Aralia. So as the name suggests, this plant is native to Japan, but it's also found in Taiwan and Korea. So this plant can be kept both indoors and outdoors. Being kept outdoors, it's basically a shade-loving plant, so you want to be keeping it either in full shade or in partial shade if you're keeping it outside. Indoors, not too hard to keep either. Bright indirect light to medium indirect light, these plants will do quite well. You just don't want to give them full sunlight as they can't really tolerate it. If you have this plant in a spot in your house where it gets full sun, it'll just crisp up more than likely. It can handle a couple of hours of sun in the day, like maybe 2 hours of morning sun or 2 hours or so of afternoon sun, as that sun in the morning and afternoon isn't as intense as the middle of the day. So if it's just getting a couple of hours of morning sun or something like that, not a big deal, it can tolerate it, but it prefers to have no sun at all if possible, just indirect light. So Fatsia Japonica is actually technically a evergreen shrub. It does get to a reasonable size, so you do want to prune it back if you're keeping it indoors especially. It can get up to 10 foot tall and also 10 foot wide. Pretty much this plant grows outwards as well as upwards, and it gets about as wide as it does tall, which is between 8 and 10 foot. You can prune it back and keep it a bit more trimmed and neater looking, I suppose, if you wanted to. That's usually what most people like to do to keep them indoors. Otherwise they do tend to grow kind of wild, left to their own devices. These plants are pretty immune to most pest insects as well, compared to most other tropical plants that you'll keep in your home. Fatsia Japonica is not so prone to pest insects. They're pretty immune to it. They are, however, prone to root rot, more so than a lot of other plants, so you do have to be careful with watering. That being said, they don't like going too long without water, but because they're prone to root rot, you do want to let them dry out a little bit between watering, just not for too long. I would advise having a well-draining soil mix as well, whether you mix some perlite in with your soil, just to aid in drainage. That goes a long way with reducing the risk of root rot, as well as just letting the plant's soil dry out for at least a couple of days before you water again. You don't want to go too long though with it dry. These plants can crisp up if they're left dry for a number of days or a week, especially in warmer temperatures. They just don't do well with dry soil. You just want to allow that day or two of dry soil just because they are kind of root rot prone plants. So when it comes to fertilizing these, it's very similar to all your other typical houseplants. Fertilize them anywhere from once a month to even once every 2 months with a liquid-based fertilizer, or alternatively you could just use a slow-release pelletized fertilizer rather than a liquid. It's honestly whatever you prefer. But for indoors, I find the liquid-based ones just easier to manage and regulate as opposed to the slow-release one. So I do mine every month. Now, as you might notice, these do have decent sized leaves, and they're kind of a unique shape compared to most other houseplants too. They're kind of a nice star-shaped leaf, and they do get bigger. When this plant reaches a much larger size than it is here in this video, its leaves will obviously be much bigger too. These plants can get leaves up to 1.5 feet in diameter, which is a decent sized leaf. So yeah, like other large leaved houseplants, they're dust collectors, and you do want to wipe those leaves down if you're keeping them indoors. At least every couple of weeks, give the leaves a wipe down, otherwise dust builds up on the leaf and it just stops the plant from photosynthesizing properly, and in turn it inhibits their growth. So if you're keeping these plants outdoors and you're living in a climate that gets kind of cold in winter, I'd say anything under 5 degrees Celsius, I would in turn bring these guys in. I like to bring mine in winter anyways, even though it doesn't get actually that cold here in winter. It gets around 15 to 10 degrees maybe Celsius in winter, depending on the day. One other thing with these plants they don't like is cold and draft, so try to keep them away from open windows if you can, or open doors, as a cold, chilly draft can kind of give you browning tips on the leaves and browning edges. So ideally keep them somewhere away from windows if you can. These plants aren't a big fan of really cold winters either, so if you're keeping it as an outdoor plant in a pot, maybe bring it in winter if it gets below 5 degrees Celsius where you live. Alternatively, they're better off just kept indoors as houseplants unless you live in a more tropical to subtropical climate anyways. But each to their own. I'm sure there are people that are keeping them outdoors in these conditions. I'm saying not to keep them in, and they're probably doing relatively okay. But just statistically, this plant generally does better in a warmer, more humid environment opposed to a cold, dry environment. So there are a couple of ways you can have this plant grow depending on the sort of maintenance you want to do and the sort of look you want to have with it. You can honestly just ignore it and let it grow as it wants to naturally. It'll end up very tall and very wide. It'll end up very bushy and then maybe a bit messy looking as well. Pretty much you'll have leaves and branches growing out of the sides of the stem as well as the top, and you'll end up with just this giant shrub. Or alternatively, if you want to have it looking more like a tree instead of a shrub, you can prune it. So for example, my umbrella tree that I've got here, most of the new growth is up top. There are some leaves coming out the sides of the stem as well, but most of the new growth is going to be up top, and there's not going to be any more new growth coming out of the sides of the plant. So long term, you're eventually going to end up with just a big stem with all the growth up top, and that's basically it. It looks nice and neat, and it kind of looks like a tree. And these kind of just do it naturally to a point where these are a bit more, like I said, messy. They'll kind of just grow new branches and leaves outside of the stem, regardless of the length of the stem. It'll just keep growing them outside as well as the top. So when it gets to a certain height, if you want to, you can actually just break off the leaves that are going down the stem and just leave the top third or the top quarter of the new leaves up top and leave the rest of the stem bare. You can do it that way, and it just looks more like a tropical tree rather than a shrub. And otherwise, when it gets too tall, you can just completely prune it back if you want to. Same as an umbrella tree. You just basically snip the tree. So this one's only quite small, so it's kind of hard to show you as an example, but imagine this stem here was much taller. I would actually just snip the head off that stem. I can then propagate that. As for where I've snipped, you want to do it just above a node if possible, but it doesn't matter too much. And where I've snipped will just regrow new leaves in time, and it'll be bushier and thicker at the top. As for the piece I've snipped away, I can propagate it. So I can just dip it in rooting hormone if I have it. Otherwise, it's not a big deal if you don't. You can just stick it in a glass of water and it will root up. And once it has a couple of inches of roots, you can then plant it. One thing I'll quickly mention, guys, sorry the frame changed. I actually forgot to mention this while I was doing the filming of this video. I just remembered while editing, so I'm quickly going to just chuck this little snippet in now. These plants actually flower as well, so they flower during autumn and they get these really nice little white pom-pom-like flowers popping out the top of the plant pretty much. So yeah, just going to throw that in there because I forgot to while I was actually filming. Anyways, back to the video. Now there are other cultivars of this plant. This is kind of just your natural variety of Fatsia Japonica. There's also another cultivar called Fatsia Japonica Spiderweb. They're kind of an acquired taste, I guess. Some people like the look of them, some people think they look a bit of an eyesore. They just look a bit sickly to some people, I suppose, but each to their own there. So the Fatsia Japonica Spiderweb is a little bit rarer in the plant hobby, I suppose. I've not seen one myself in person. But as far as I know, they don't grow anywhere as quickly as the natural variety. There is also a variegated version as well, which is similar to the spiderweb in terms of that it doesn't grow as quickly. This is because the variegations in those leaves don't really photosynthesize as well as the natural green pigments. And if the plant is if the plant's got 50% variegated color, it's not going to photosynthesize half as well as a natural variety. Therefore, it's not going to grow as quickly. As for repotting this plant, I do it once a year. You can let it go once every 2 years if you want to, but ideally once a year is fine, provided the plant's growing and doing well. You don't want to do it any more frequent than that. Repotting too regularly can promote problems like root rot, or repotting in a pot that's too big can also promote problems like root rot. You want to only go up 1 inch every year, or one pot size every year. So if you're in an 8-inch pot, wait a year, go to a 9-inch, wait another year, go to a 10-inch. Don't go from an 8 to a 12-inch pot or something like that. Reason being, if you put this plant in a pot that's way too big, too quickly, you're going to have all this excess soil surrounding your plant that's going to hold a lot of moisture when you water that the plant will not utilize yet because its roots haven't reached that section of the pot at the time. And all this wet soil that stays very wet for quite a while is going to promote bacterial and fungal infections, which is basically what root rot is. So ideally you just want to go up 1 pot size every year, so there's just enough soil around the edges of your plant to give it a bit more space to grow, but it can still reach that and utilize it relatively quickly, and that little bit of soil isn't going to hold water for as long as a large amount of soil would in a bigger pot. So overall, I'd say the Fatsia Japonica is a great type of houseplant if you want something that gets a bit bigger and bushier and fills in a space quite well. As I said, kept outside, it is a shade-loving plant, so keep it in a shaded area if possible, like an understory area or a shaded wall or something like that. Indoors, bright indirect light, it does great. So, as a brief recap on this plant, so you don't forget anything I've said, keep it somewhere with bright indirect light, let it dry out a few days between watering, give it a well-draining soil, because as I said, it's prone to root rot, wipe your leaves down, prune it back if needed, you can propagate from a stem. Repot once a year or once every 2 years, go up in pot size every year. Anyways guys, so that's basically my thoughts on the Fatsia Japonica. If you want a houseplant that gets really, really big and grows really quickly and has a really unique star-shaped leaf with that nice glossy sheen to it, grab a Fatsia Japonica, they're a great houseplant. Or if you have a shaded spot in your backyard and you just want something to fill it in, again, grab one of these, they do pretty well for you. And before I go, don't forget to like and bing that notification bell. Instagram's down below if you'd like to follow me there as well. But until then, I'll see you all in my next video. Bye bye.